All right, hi Dan. This is Joe from MiddleGround. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Hey Joe, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right, give us a little bit of a background for yourself, so the viewers and listeners can get an idea.
Sure. Well, my name is Dan Schaefer. Last November, I ran for the Missouri House of Representatives, District 97, which is just south of St. Louis. It's in a place called Jefferson County. Fairly red district. I ran as a Democrat, a progressive sort of Democrat. Managed to get a little bit over 35% of the vote, which is pretty surprising because I ran against a Republican incumbent. So I'm going to run again in 2026. I plan to run again for the Missouri House of Representatives. Prior to that, though, I was basically an engineer my whole life. I was educated as an electrical engineer got my degree about a century and a half ago, and worked in St. Louis for a few years. Then I took off for Los Angeles. I thought, well, I'll work in Los Angeles, see what it's like for maybe a couple of years, then I'll come back, right? About 30 years later, I came back. So raised a family out there. My son still lives out there. And along the way, I didn't just work as an engineer. Of course, I did lots of hardware and software design. That was fun. But then I decided to break out of my shell a little bit and work with the salespeople, be a sales engineer, which basically put me on the road, or should I say in the air, traveled the world really for about 10 years, traveled mainly to Europe, a little bit of Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, and then also South Asia, like India.
Nice.
Been there a couple times. In the Middle East, mainly just Israel. And in the process, I'm doing all this traveling. I'm getting to know a whole lot of people all around the world, and get to talk with them one on one. Not only about business stuff, but you always go out to dinner afterwards and you talk about things. And one thing I learned is that no matter where you are in the world, people are people. They all have the same concerns. And that gave me a pretty good education. Um, After that, I worked in marketing for a few years. I was a marketing operations manager. I knew nothing about marketing, but well, there I was working in the marketing department. And then I worked in training for a while. And yeah, then I lost my job out in California. So then I came back to Missouri, worked another job just purely as a software engineer for about 9 years. Then I got laid off there. And since then, I was in my 60s at the time, and I thought, I'm not going to find any more jobs. That's it. Nobody's going to hire an engineer in his 60s. So but prior to that, I started doing podcasts, started doing political podcasts in 2019, and produced podcasts under two different titles. And in the process, interviewed about 200 people and got to know a lot of folks all across the U.S. Some popular, some not so popular, but spanned the spectrum between book authors, activists. You see, I've interviewed a prisoner one time. Actually, I've interviewed a prisoner twice, and defense lawyers, politicians, you name it. And it was really a learning experience for me. I'd say it's fun, but as you probably know, Joe, these podcasts can be a whole lot of work too. So
Yeah, they can be.
yeah, when I decided to run for office, I decided, okay, I got to do one or the other. Either I got to do a podcast or run for office. And so I decided to set aside the podcasting and just focus on politics.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of work.
It is, yeah.
Some one of the big things, just looking on some of your stance per se on issues. One thing that I guess would say would be near and dear to me is I believe it's Medicare for all.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily, even being middle of the road, tend to lean conservative, I'm not even opposed to something like that. But where I think a lot of conservatives and even people who are flip flop on the vote depending on the issue is they don't really trust the federal government to administer things in Michigan the way they would need to be, because they would take the same approach in Michigan as they would Missouri or California.
Right.
And I think that's where sometimes I think you do need like a blanket approach per se, but I think it's got to be more of a funding approach with a mandate to the state with like a bucket of insurances. For instance, Germany, ironically, they have a mixture system. They have public and private, Private hospitals have to accept so many public patients, even if you're a private institution. But even their private insurance has no copays. So in the United States, private businesses seem to do a better job managing costs than our government does. So yeah, I think kind of like a mixed approach, but controlling what people would pay.
Well, I'm going to take exception to that and I'm going to take a conservative path to that exception as well. If you look at all the industrialized nations in the world and look at the price per capita that we pay for healthcare, that's insurance, that's every time you get a runny nose, you go to the doctor, etc. We're at about $12,000 per person. And I can dig up the receipts for that as well. The next closest country is like $8,000. Germany, if I recall correctly, is somewhere around $7,000. Canada is somewhere around $6,000. So, from a conservative perspective, I got to look at this and say, where's all that money going? When you see these health insurance company CEOs and upper level management getting these obnoxious bonuses, to the tune of tens of millions of dollars per year.
It's crazy.
How efficient is that? How efficient is it every time you go to the doctor's office? And my wife worked in a psychiatrist's office as an administrator, so I know firsthand how this happens. They hate dealing with these insurance companies. Everybody's got a different company they deal with. Every company has their own little policies, and there's a bunch of gearheads out there that try to get their heads around this whole thing by creating software to get around it, but it still comes down to just basically pulling your hair out with every single patient to figure out how much do they copay, how much will the insurance cover? Oh, gee, you haven't met your deductible on your insurance, so you got to write us a check for $200. It's mind-boggling how much time and energy is spent going through all this and fighting with insurance companies to get coverage.
Oh yeah,
And
I've been there.
yeah, so I gotta really question that premise that the government would do it less efficiently than that. I think that's a pretty low bar already. I
Very
think the
true.
government
Very
should be
true.
able to jump over that thing. And I'm listening to Bernie Sanders, and I don't know where he gets his data from, so I'm just going to parrot what he says. But 2% of our premiums go toward the administrative part of Medicare.
Yeah, I believe it's like $5,000 or whatever that is for
Yeah,
a
something like
person.
that. So, and Medicare basically takes care of people like me. I just turned 65, so they take care of the highest cost patients out there. They do so, if Bernie is right, they do so with burning only 2% of your premium versus 15 to 20% of your premium is getting burned by giving these CEOs their next yacht next summer. So, yeah, the reason why I say it's a conservative approach, it's like, okay, if you're going to be conservative, which I am fiscally conservative, I'm looking at these numbers and I'm saying there's got to be a better way. First of all, with the single payer healthcare or Medicare for all, single payer healthcare, you get rid of all that funny business of having to deal with many different insurance companies. You deal only with essentially one company, which in this case would be the government. Everybody's covered, no questions asked, right? Well, question being, are you a citizen or not,
Right.
or you're a legal resident or whatever. But that being the case, I'd really urge people to look at the numbers and think about it in conservative terms. Now, the insurance company has a very powerful lobby, of course, and so they put out the word that says, "Oh, the government always messes everything up. They're going to screw it up. They're going to waste, fraud, and abuse." Which, by the way, Elon Musk wasn't able to find very much of, by the way. So, and the government is transparent. Ideally, I found some politicians like Eric Schmidt, who's the one of the senators from Missouri, very non-transparent person. I've asked him through various different sunshine requests to provide more information, and he refuses to. But putting that aside, the government is fairly transparent about what it does and where the money goes. And if anybody's curious enough, they can look into it. And if they need to, they can file a Freedom of Information Act or something like that and expose it. And you got a whole army of journalists out there who are looking at these things and
Yeah.
just trying to find, especially the conservative guys, they're going to try to find a problem in the system. And we need those people.
Everybody
to do
plays a
that.
role.
Right. So it's kind of a long-winded answer right there, but I do
Oh
take
yeah.
exception with that because that I think single-payer healthcare is really the answer to a lot of this.
Well, I agree. Like, I just think it's a little, maybe to clarify a little bit better, right? So part of my stance is the healthcare industry is not really, it's capitalist in terms of it's for profit,
Correct.
but as an overall ideal and as a system, it's not capitalist because the government picks the winners and the losers with it. They say
Yeah.
you can be an insurance company. My family doctor was telling me in Michigan, I don't know if it's still there, and I know some states do it, but they limit the amount of beds a hospital system can have. So if you build another hospital, you got to X beds from X amount to, and I'm like, that makes absolutely zero sense.
Yeah, that is that is an issue that I think needs to be resolved because I don't like government getting that involved in private industry, but you know, people will talk about this as being socialized medicine, which it isn't. The UK has socialized medicine.
We would Medicare doesn't go down that far.
And Medicare doesn't go down that far. Doesn't go down that far either. Just like I would model it, I would try to model it more closer to Canada, where their hospitals, their doctors, and everything. They're all their own industry. They are. There's probably some regulations, obviously, like you
Naturally.
can't take out someone's left kidney when you're supposed to take out their right kidney or something like that. But it's they're but they're all private industries, and so yeah, I would think like if a hospital is going to make a decision like how many beds do we want, that should be a capitalist sort of decision. That should be based on what their anticipated load is and how much money they're getting for each patient and so on. That should be their decision to make.
Yeah, and I think that contributes to part of the problems we have. The United Healthcare CEO, I don't know if he still is, but after I forget the gentleman's name that was shot and
Oh yeah, yeah,
murdered,
yeah,
the
yeah.
gentleman that filled in for him did a very rare thing that anybody in the healthcare industry that's an executive does. He goes, America doesn't have a system, we have a patchwork. And I was like, when he said that, I'm going, man, I'm floored to hear any healthcare executive say something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Because usually they're staunchly defending the system that they think, saying that's what it is. So, the fact that he was willing to say that, I think, is a sign that the United States is going in a different direction. Probably going to take a while. We do things very slow here compared to the rest of our counterparts around the world. I think that's probably one of the big things. Transition a little bit here. So, one of the things that I read that you like to talk about is unions and organized labor. They play, in your state, they play an equitable role in Missouri and why they are under attack. Me being from Detroit, the labor unions were under attack here for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
And, some of it, my father being in a union, but some of it, at the time he felt was kind of justified because he said, these contracts they're handing us don't represent us. All it
Hmm.
is a big handout to to the company. And something that I felt that the unions didn't do a good job of when they negotiated their contracts is when you do a pension, it shouldn't be funded as whenever the company feels like, no, it should be funded as you go. You got X amount of people entering the pension, you increase your percentage to X amount. And I feel that's why the pension system failed because a lot of people up here, when the government steps in, I think it's only 50% of, from the Pension Guarantee Corporation. And, but the one thing I can say is, knowing a lot of manufacturing things up here is the unions definitely made it a safer thing to work at, and they definitely raised wages because if not, you could be producing a $500,000 car and getting paid $10 an hour.
Yeah, I'm very much pro union, but I'm not naive either because I know that some of the issues that come up with the unions, their failure to negotiate good contracts. Uh, there's waste, fraud, and abuse within the unions themselves. The feeling that unions don't represent you completely. I get all that, but those are problems that you fix. Those are course corrections,
Mm-hmm.
basically. I don't want to trivialize it because some of these problems are pretty severe, but I look at those as course corrections. Overall, this is again, I'm going to get conservative on you. Unions built the middle class.
Yes.
Starting in the 1940s and through the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, they built the middle class, and the middle class was a very, very strong uh, base of operation for the United States. Starting in the 1980s, starting really, I think that the linchpin I put in this thing is when Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers in early 1981. That started this cascading process of unions being under fire from the government. And now what we see are unions down to about half of what they were in 1980. And we're just seeing Trump getting into office and basically through Elon Musk firing a lot of these federal unions, tearing up their contracts essentially. And so
Yeah,
you
I
have
didn't agree
an
with that.
extremely anti-union president. Musk is notorious for being anti-union.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
so you're gonna. So this is why I say I'm getting conservative, because if you want to go back and make America great again, whatever that means. But if you want to say, okay, build out the middle class, which I think made America great, let's get back to that then. Let's get back to union representation. Let's get back to workers' rights. Yeah, it's going to cost business some money. Well, what's happening now is that people can't even afford to buy the stuff that they're making. Henry
right.
Ford, I think, said it perfectly about a century ago. He says, I want to pay my people enough so they can afford to buy one of my cars. And I think that was um, he was kind of a jerk in other ways, but
Yeah,
he
yeah,
got
yeah. I've
that
read a
right.
lot about him, and he's his persona is not very well publicized. He was not a
Yeah.
very polite person behind the scenes.
No, no. But you got to make a hero out of people, so people think of him as a hero. And he did have some very innovative ideas, but he was kind of a jerk in many ways too.
Yeah, I'm from Detroit, so I'm a diehard Detroit Lions fan. So I've had the pleasure of touring their stadium and being inside the suite that the Fords they take in tour, and I got to meet Bill Ford one time. Really nice guy. I mean, and he actually lives in the suburbs in Ann Arbor, which is definitely a little bit more of an uppity area.
Hmm.
But it's not this like remote foresty area. No, he actually kind of lives among
Among the
the
people.
wealthy people, if you want to call it that. He doesn't
Yeah.
hide.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the Fords, they were they tried to do everything they could to keep the union out back then. I mean, that was the natural course. Um, but over time, I think the Fords accepted it. They've actually worked to me really well with the UAW to try to bring Detroit back, not keep,
Yeah.
but then bring
Yeah.
Detroit back. And uh, you know, a big thing up here, like you were talking about, like steel and things like that, is one of the locations that I oversee is right next to where a U.S. steel plant that over the last 2-3 years has pretty much been all but shut down. It processes steel for the most part. Now it doesn't really make steel anymore,
Hmm.
and that community has just been decimated. When I
Yeah.
tell you decimated, like it's like you drive down the main road and you're just like there's nobody. It's
Yeah.
a ghost town, and there's still a lot of people that live there, but there's nothing to do there, and half the party stores and gas stations are all closed, and it's and part of the problem is that's why when then I think it's pronounced Nippon
Nippon. Nippon
Nippon
Steel. Yeah.
that in U.S. Steel. I guess I'm hesitant to hand over the full reins to a foreign company. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Me too.
I think that there should be a clause in there that in any time an act of war, things of that nature, boom, it's automatically cut off.
Yeah.
I know that that's not a very popular position among conservatives, but I think with the Defense Act, that's something that we could do. And I think that would protect union jobs. But I guess for me, I'm going, hey, why aren't our billionaires in this country investing into our industries that would prop unions up? Not want to say prop them up. Okay, that's a bad way to say it. That would build the companies that where the unions are up. That would build the middle class that could buy their products. Like, where is that lost anymore? Because that was, the robber barons, as bad as a lot of things they did. They also recognized that. They said, "Oh, hey, look, we're paying these folks more, and they're buying more of our products." That just seems to be lost.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a basic understanding of economics too, is that money doesn't do any good unless it's circulating. And if you get to a point where the velocity of the dollar goes down, as they say, or you get to a point where money's being extracted from society, it's not being reinvested back in society. Uh, that's where you start running into issues. You start running into the wealth gap. We have a tremendous wealth gap today. I've been told it's even worse than back in the Gilded Age in the late 1890s. And yeah, the result is, yeah, you get a population out there that they can't afford the products that they're building. But here's something else I want to lay on to you. It's I'd read this about Walmart as well as Amazon, that a lot of their employees, they don't pay them enough to live on, so they rely, at least partially, on uh, government, what's that called, like
Public.
help or whatever.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So we're essentially subsidizing these companies by allowing them to pay their employees so little money that we, you and me, our taxpayer, our money is going toward buying SNAP benefits for another family, helping with medical costs. And I'm all for that. I mean, we're Americans. We should be taking care of each other, but not to the point where we're further enriching people who already have the money.
Yeah.
I think it's,
For sure.
if you want to be responsible to the community, you have to be a responsible member of that community. And whether
Yes.
you're Ford or if you're just, you know, Joe's Crab Shack down the road here or something, you've got to contribute something to that committee. I mean, to the community.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They
And
don't do a good job of that anymore.
yeah, they don't. And the counter argument to that is, well, that's not really capitalism. I say, yeah, it's not really capitalism, but capitalism doesn't have any chapters in its book with regards to community service and ensuring the health of the community. It's all about profits. And so that's why capitalism, left to its own devices, would never survive on its own. It has to form a partnership with whatever free society it operates in.
Yeah.
In
Oh
our
yeah.
case, we are a constitutional republic or a democracy, whatever, however you want to pronounce it. Uh, we have to have regulations. We
Oh
don't
yeah.
want to do over. We don't want to overregulate, but we have to have some regulations to make sure that communities are being helped by these corporations, and that corporations are being helped by the community.
Well, a case in point, I would say, of balance of capitalism and government going too far would be, ironically, California.
You
Uh,
think so?
in certain instances, right? I'm not against everybody getting paid a good wage, zero issue with that. But there seemed to be, they essentially got the fast food wage there, and then they've got, like, different, like, wage laws per se, and I just that's it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And then when you look at the homelessness rate there, with a lot
Yeah.
of with what California does for its people, and I'm not knocking what it does for its people, right? But I feel like things are just so lopsided depending on the issue that there's nothing to really counterbalance it to make things even. And some of it hasn't really helped the homeless people there. It's just, like, from what my understanding is, I've never been to San Diego or San Francisco, but I've heard that, their problem is sometimes just as big as LA's in terms of when you're walking around, what you're seeing. And what I've seen on TV and things like that, I can walk around Detroit and I don't see nothing I mean, not that Detroit's in any great shape, but I don't see that nowhere near the amount of homeless people there, like,
Yeah.
all over the streets.
Well, winters are pretty harsh in Detroit,
Yeah.
and they're not so harsh in California, especially. I mean, like I say, I lived out there for like almost 30 years, and half that time I lived pretty close to the beach, and the weather out there is absolutely livable if you're outside. There are days where it's not. There's days when it rains, and sometimes I've even known it to snow out there. But for the most part, it is easier to live if you're homeless. So I would think, if I'm going to be homeless, I'm going to go to a place like California because I'm going to be living outside, and it's really hard to live outside when you're living in Detroit, I would think. So that's one reason. Yeah, another one is, I think, California obviously has some issues with homelessness, but also, having lived out there for a very long time, I saw homelessness as well. But I think that you can overblow it by looking at it through the lens of news, or of news teams that go out there and just want to focus on homelessness. It's the same thing with these protests that over the last couple of days. The
Oh, yeah.
protests in LA.
Definitely, people made out to be like, there was definitely some criminals, but those were definitely in the minority.
They're definitely in a minority, and there's a whole lot of stories. So there's never one story that's completely accurate, including mine. But one thing I know about LA and I know about the media is that LA itself is huge. It's like a big carpet. If you ever landed at night in LA, there's just city lights as far as you can see. It's unlike any other city I've ever been around. Everything's spread out there because real estate was real cheap at one point. So everything got spread out. And so the so-called, protests, some people want to call them riots, very, very small area, very small. And even within that protest, I don't know about you, but I was looking on TikTok, I was looking at some live videos of what's going on there, and there was really just people marching and chanting and having a good time and so on. And yeah, there was a few places where things got a little dicey, um, but for the most part, it was not an issue. It
Yeah,
was just,
we got a big Hispanic population here in Southwest Detroit.
oh
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, I mean it is. I mean, it is huge for that city, and they're some of the greatest people you'll ever meet. Detroit was obviously on the decline for a long time, but the one thing you go there, and obviously, still necessary per se an economically depressed area, but the immigrants there have taken care of their community. You go through
yeah,
there,
they do.
there's still like a downtown kind of area there where pretty much everybody from Metro Detroit goes down there to eat. If you want Mexican and you live in Metro Detroit, you go to Southwest Detroit. I mean, people would make a 45-minute hour trek to go down there
Yeah,
because a lot of it's authentic. They've got Mexican bakeries down there, a lot of very good people. And ironically, I mean, yeah, there was some protest there, but um, Detroit was never, I guess, considered a sanctuary city. So when there was issues, I'm guessing with the ICE or whoever had before, long before the current president, I guess, nobody in Detroit was really quote unquote harboring them, if you want to call it that. If it was somebody that was a wanted criminal. So I don't think you've seen here the amount of chaos from the ICE raids that you in some cities that would, because they're trying to protect people that essentially are just innocent people going to work every day. But, they're protecting their relative or whatever who somehow has become a criminal through maybe no fault of their own circumstance, however you want to word it. And I think that's kind of where that gets drawn into it. Whereas here, it's, if they get wind of it, okay, hey, you're a bad guy, you got to go. And
yeah.
I think
I,
that's
I
what's
don't.
helped us here.
I don't think anybody would. Well, I don't know everybody, but I would think there's very few people that would argue with the idea of getting rid of the criminals out there. The problem is when you're pulling into a Home Depot parking lot or something like that and just grabbing people, and you're really sort of justifying it later. You're not presenting any identification. I continually hear where people are not presenting their badge. They're not presenting an
Yeah, that's
identification. It just says
unconstitutional.
ICE across their chest. And I personally would wonder, if I'm witness to somebody rolling up and just grabbing people off the street, I would stand in it. I'd get in the middle of that too. I don't know if
Yeah,
these people are being kidnapped. I don't know if they're legal. They don't even know who they're picking up half the time. They pick them up, then they try to figure it out later on, and then by that time it's too late. So I think everybody's sort of looking at this quota that was supposed to be something like Steve Miller said, something like 3 million or 3,000 people per day. If you get that kind of quota, yeah, you're going to go to the courthouse and pick up people who are legitimately trying to become American residents or American citizens. You get people rolling up into the Home Depot parking lot. There has not been, and I know firsthand living in California, and I've known quite a few people who were illegal. Supposedly, they weren't citizens, but I don't know if they were illegal aliens or not. They may have been here by permission. Known quite a few people, and I got to tell you, you won't find a group of people that are more hardworking people, willing to do a lot of things, and honest. Yeah, there's a criminal element, but like any society, there's criminal people of every different color out there. So um, yeah,
yeah,
so that's my argument with that.
yeah. The approach that I equate it to is I think we need to take the Ronald Reagan approach and say, hey, you know what? As long as you've been here, you don't have anything, pretty much hanging over your head. We're going to get you on the payrolls. We're going to make sure that, and to me, that makes a lot more fiscal sense not just in terms of it saves the government money, but it also puts a lot more funds into the treasury and help pay for some of those things that people are claiming the illegals are using.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Social Security being one of them. Yeah.
right. So, I think it's, we need more people paying into the system to cover, what's coming up. So to me, it's like, hey, it's not a terrible idea to give these people a path and put them on the payrolls. And if anything, it's our companies taking advantage of the illegals. And by keeping these people illegal, I feel like it suppresses the wages because it gives certain companies,
Yeah.
certain elements, the ability to underpay someone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And a good industry to point to would be the chicken industry.
Hmm.
So they kind of essentially franchise it out, and then down on these farms, a lot of them tend to employ either a single person or they employ somebody that's not documented that they can pay a lesser wage to, because the chicken industry says, hey, we're only going to pay X amount for a chicken, which is below the market value. And the only way that farmer can make money is if he finds somebody that he pays a significant, dollars and dollar amount less than, he would a citizen. And I think that that's kind of where that comes in the immigration debate. And I think that's where a lot of Americans get frustrated, right? They'll be like, hey, if you're in a heavy immigrant community, I'm a carpenter, I've worked here my whole life. And now all of a sudden this guy's coming along getting paid half of what I am. I know the guy who's doing it, but I also know the government won't do anything about it. And I think that fuels it, right? But then you also get that person's family members, and then that person's family, and that's what creates the fire that you have. And rather than anybody going, hey, let's put these people on the payroll so they make the same wage you do, or within that ballpark, put them on an even, okay, now we're on an even, competition. And
Even footing. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's kind of what's lost. It's just people panic so much over the last 4 years. Even people from all these departments that had worked under other Democratic presidents said they were just like, yeah, pretty much they just said let everybody come through the front door, and it was they didn't really there was no control. Yeah, right. I think it was like outside of the European mass migration, it was like one of the biggest periods of migration to the United States in our history.
Hmm.
um, and I think that's what freaked people out. COVID was happening. All these people are coming across the border, and of course, no matter which news channel you watched, it was just chaos looking, right? They're not going to focus on everybody else that's just patiently waiting. They're just going to focus on even CNN or Fox News. They're all just going to focus on what's going wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think it's fair to the immigrants. I don't think it's fair to the American people. And I'm sure you have heard of John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania. He's probably one of my favorite Democratic politicians. He's not afraid to say, hey, this Republican thing that they're doing makes sense. But he's also not afraid to sit there and say, hey, it's a terrible idea and you're going to hurt people.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of approach is what's needed on immigration, and it's just completely vanished. It's just you're either pro letting everybody walk through the front door, no questions asked, or you're just kick everybody out and lock them.
I actually I don't consider that perspective that often, but I do like that perspective because going back to what you said about putting everybody on equal footing, um, that really does solve a lot of problems out there. One of them is, and you've identified, which was the abuse of these immigrants that come in and like, yeah, who are you going to tell? We're going to underpay you, but who are you going to tell? Well, yeah, if you put them on equal footing and put everybody on equal footing and give them the work visa or whatever it is that they need, you're going to get a lot more work done. Yeah, there's going to be more competition in the field. If you're a carpenter and some guy comes up from Mexico and he's a carpenter, you're going to be competing with him. Okay. But um, yeah, I think that that could be an issue. A lot of people would argue about that issue. But on the other hand, if you have two really good carpenters out there, they're going to get a lot of business if they're really good at what they're doing.
Yeah, to me, that's probably one of the best things I think Ronald Reagan ever did. And he
Mm-hmm.
didn't hide behind it. He didn't hide it. He didn't try to sweep it under. He was open about during his campaign. He don't get me wrong. He did a lot of things wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but I also think he did a lot of things from the heart, and I don't think a lot of things were vindictive.
Yeah.
And he really felt for people. He was a former Democrat. So I think that that's a big thing. And tying into immigration, he talked about is like public education. From what you were saying is a central issue for your campaign. Just give me like my mother-in-law was she did charter teaching, she did public education teaching. She's got a master's degree. And ironically, she found that the charter schools, she had more ability to focus on how to educate the kids than being told by, like, just a straight line, you got to do it this way because this is what this says. And she found that, she taught a lot of inner city kids. And ironically, one of the schools was partially funded by the Ford family. And but she was like, it gives them more control to, okay, if you've got Susie B who learns better, these learns better like this. Whereas, sometimes in public schools things tend to be a little bit more cut and dry. And I'm not advocating one way or the other. I think that I think both ways have a place in education. Because like I've said, like a problem with the country our size is Missouri is different than California. California is different than Michigan. Everybody's approach and how we think, how we process is all going to be different.
Yeah, that's you bring up a pretty good point there. I would say that in Missouri here, the research I've done is the charter schools are not producing any better results than than the public schools. Um, but that could vary by area or whatever. So
Yeah,
if
for
it's
sure.
different in Michigan, I totally get that. The only thing I have a problem with well, the big thing I have a problem with education is that I don't have that much of a rural area in my district. I have some rural area, but Missouri itself has a lot of rural areas out there. They don't have school choice. Everybody screams school choice, and they don't have a choice. If you're living in a county and the next private school might be 20 miles up the road with no bus service, what are you going to do? But meanwhile, the public school, and public schools, by the way, in some of these smaller towns across the rural areas, I'm sure the same thing in Michigan as well, is that these schools become the center of community activity.
Oh yeah.
The football games on Friday nights, the bake-offs and things like that take place. It becomes part of the culture of the people. And so when you try to siphon off some of that public money to go into charter schools, that takes away from the rural communities. Another thing too is you mentioned about charter schools, about the teachers have more freedom. I would say that depends on the charter school, and it
Yeah,
really
for
depends a
sure.
lot on the charter itself. The fact of charter schools is that they're run by corporations. They're not run by the public. So when you have a public school, it's run by the school board. You can go to the school board meetings. You're basically a shareholder. Even if you don't have kids, you're a shareholder in that school system. You can go to the board meetings. You can run for the board if you want to. I mean, if you got that much time and can put up with all the aggravation, you
No
can.
way. No way.
There's a lot of aggravation, yeah. So I mean, but these are the options that are open to you. But try to do that in a charter school. Well, now you're dealing with a corporation, and so do we want to take our education and hide it behind a corporate curtain where we don't have any control over it? Where the charter that gets negotiated is decided by a panel, a board of people, and you really don't have any input to it. Yeah, I'm just really opposed to doing things that way. But I agree, we also need to up our game in our public school
Yeah.
system. I think one of the worst things happened was George W. Bush with this No Child Left Behind thing, where they started where they started teaching kids for the test rather than teaching them for content, and that was a huge mistake. I think George W. Bush's heart was in the right place,
Oh yeah,
but I
great.
think that was an experiment that went awry, and they should have recognized that a few years into it, and it took them way too long to figure that out.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it was a response to, I think, for 20 years our education system had, the scores had been declining, right? And
Right.
through, despite all of his faults, which a lot of presidents have, and he tends to have more than not, he was the one thing I think a lot of people say is, I think that guy truly cared in his heart about kids. You
He
know,
did. He does. Yeah, he did, and he
yeah,
still does. Yeah.
and he took on, he kept the child health care thing. He really pushed for that. Even with that whole fiasco between California and the dollar amount, I remember from back then. A lot of things that in today's cancel age, no matter which party you're on, he would have been canceled a long time ago. But getting back to education, I have a 6-year-old son. He's autistic. I have a 15-year-old and a 6-year-old. But my 6-year-old is, I don't know if you want to call it school choice. We live in one district, ironically 2 miles down the road, a whole nother district.
Mm-hmm.
But that school system down the road has a way better phenomenal setup for him. When he first started going to school, they were like, oh, we don't know if he's ever really going to be able to talk, this, that, the other thing. Well, now he's in general education. He has a para to kind of help him. He still speaks in phrases, but he's learned to talk a lot of sentences, and
Mm-hmm.
speech delay is common on my dad's side of the family. They call it an autistic thing, but I'm very reluctant to agree with them on that. I didn't speak a full sentence until I was 7 years old, and I think I'm doing quite okay.
You're
With
doing
my
okay. Yeah,
right with my
doing good.
right, and so I challenged that a lot. I challenged the education's view of autism because it kind of sees when you're looking at education, they go, you're autistic rather than you're a person that has autism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that that's the number one problem. For instance, when my son got medically diagnosed, he had to see 8 different therapists or doctors, whatever you want to call it, 2 4-hour sessions. And they're
Wow.
going, 2 separate days, a couple weeks apart before. And they're going, well, he doesn't want to come up to us. Well, first, like or not, I know a lot of kids that don't just stroll up to a stranger they've never seen before.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And the forms that they use, and this is where, the education system to me has a lot of problems. It's a form that ranges from age 4 to 12. How can like, well, we want to see, but how can you truly get any kind of inclination on a form that has that much of a range?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they were saying like chewing on a pen cap or a pen in school is a tick, and I'm going, man, I did that in high school all the time. And
Yeah. I know a lot of kids that did that. Yeah.
right, and so and I feel like that's kind of where education goes. Is it's more about like here in Michigan, they passed essentially a law that says insurance companies can't limit autistic treatment. You can't
Mm-hmm.
go, well, you get 3 visits to your buddy and that's it. If you're diagnosed as autistic, they can't limit it. Which to me, if you're medically needed, it shouldn't be limited no matter what you are. But, you know, it, the schools don't do a good job of combining with that, and so they make this broad thing to where my doctor was telling me is they've made it so broad so that way if a child needs something in school, it can get covered because they're considered autistic. So a child that 30 years ago may not be considered autistic, just needs a little help, is now autistic. So the school is forced to help that kid with more resources than maybe the kid needs. And I'm not saying we should cut any resources, but if the kid just needs speech therapy, why are we limiting it, autistic or not? Like that to me, that's the most confusing part, considering we're ranked what 25th, I believe, in industrialized nations in K through 12,
Yeah.
and we
Something like that.
spend more than the top 10 combined per child, or however they want to word it. I'm sure you can cut that cheesecake 10 different ways.
No,
But
it
so it's
sounds reasonable.
yeah, it's very concerning. So I've kind of my wife says I've gone off the radar, or off the reservation, gone to go rogue, and I'll challenge the doctors. Now, don't get me wrong. Do I believe my son's autistic? Yeah, he has a lot of things that he does that definitely fall in that line. But I just don't like the education and the medical's approaches that there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
Comparativism in Germany, something that's becoming popular there is stem cell therapy for autistic kids, where it helps
Mm-hmm.
repair the brain, the areas that didn't quite, develop the way they needed to. It's
Right.
still in the very early phases, but it's just for education. It's just a lot of it doesn't make sense. It's so they do things so broad so that way everybody can be covered. When it's just like there shouldn't be a limit on what our kids need. You shouldn't have to make a special law to go, hey, you need speech therapy. Hey, you need behavioral therapy. Why do you need to me that shouldn't be a law. That should just be part of like how the system is set up.
Yeah, and that's what you ended with right there is exactly where I was about to pick up because the system is set up that way. And I don't know your particular situation there, but if it were me being the analytical minded engineer that I am, I would look at who's getting money out of this deal, and where, follow the money, as they say. Where's the incentive? It may not even be money. It may just be job security or something like that. And I'm not saying it sounds like I'm launching a conspiracy theory or something
Oh
like
yeah,
that.
no,
I don't want to sound that way, but I mean, you have a child that is just different than what they think the child should be. Uh, yeah, my experience is, I mean, I grew up I was born in 1959, so I grew up like in the 60s and 70s. We had kids like that all the time, and they were just like, they hung in there. It's like, okay,
right.
they got issues, right? But the teachers would work with them, sometimes one on one. It didn't seem to be an issue, and I don't really know when it comes to autism. I know I'm kind of taking a digression here, but when it comes to autism, is it that they're just too loose and free with the definition of
Yes,
autism?
yes, big time.
Or is it maybe there's more autistic kids today for some other element in our environment that's causing it? Maybe it's BPC plastics or something. Who knows? But I tend to think I'm conservative in that area too. I'm like, okay, just make the kid go to school every day. He has a little bit of a speech problem. You get him some speech therapy or something like that, and see where that leads. The real, I mean, I hear it all the time. This kid's autistic. That kid's autistic. I'm just, this is where I'm not progressive at all. I'm very
Right.
conservative. I'm like, are you guys just trying to pull the wool over my eyes, or what's going on here, right? And I tell you something else about about education. People with so-called PhDs in education. I've dealt with a lot of them in my life, especially in the technical world. I'm not impressed.
No,
I'm gonna be
no.
honest with you. I'm not impressed. They say, "Oh, I got a PhD in education." I'm like, okay, that's like having a PhD in underwater basket weaving. I mean, it's not quite that bad or anything, but I'm not. I just people have like PhDs in like cellular biology or something like that. Okay, now I got respect for that dude because I know that's not an easy thing to do, or even if it's law or something like that. I got a whole lot more respect for them, and I can engage with them on a very deep basis. But education to me just has not impressed me that much, and maybe it's just me. But that's why I would, I'm kind of digressing here, but that's why I would look at closer at who has the incentive to label every kid autistic, and who's gaining something from this,
Yeah,
and I
the
would look
medical
closely at
community,
that.
big time.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me into somebody that I guess I'm very passionate and very for is RFK.
Hmm.
And I know that he can be controversial, especially to the left now.
Hmm.
But up until he joined Trump, he was a staunch Democrat his whole life. He
Yeah, with the Kennedy family.
yeah,
Yeah.
he just decided, hey, this is my avenue to get the things that I'm passionate about out there, and he was willing to reach across the aisle. I've got no doubt, based on things I've seen of him, that he probably opposes 70% of what comes out of Trump's mouth. But what he was willing to do is he goes, okay, hey, we both want to fix these kind of problems, right? So getting the dyes and all the stuff out of the food, and my boss, a little bit older than me, but we both have young children, and he goes, we both kind of started following RFK around the presidential campaign, just kind of caught on to it. And he cut out all those dyes and everything from his kids' food. And he said it completely changed their behavior.
Hmm.
He said his kids are a little bit more like, I want to say like easygoing, right? But they don't have as many, they don't go crazy, right? Uh, I mean, I guess, he would know that a little bit more. So with my son, I'm trying to work on doing that as well. Just, getting the goldfish away from him are definitely a challenge. But there's a lot of people out there that say, hey, and I don't even call them like health nuts or conspiracy theorists, but they've said, hey, when we get away from these certain things with our kids, we're noticing that they don't need this or that to just function, and in the red dye, I think it's the red dye number 4 or 40. I can't remember whichever one that was that.
That titanium in it or whatever they call it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was the one that they had banned in cosmetics in 1990 because
Okay.
it couldn't be
Okay.
on your skin, right? But then they're
Yeah.
going, but you can still eat it. Now, granted, I get that that's a whole different process, but you can't sit there and convince me that if it's not safe to be on my skin, that I can eat it.
Well, dental amalgams made
True.
out of mercury. I still got a couple of them in my head. My dentist replaced most of them already, but that's like, no, mercury's poison. It's poison. We're going to stick this mercury in your mouth, and it's going to stay there for like the next 50 years. It's a mercury-based amalgams to fill your cavities and stuff. I'm like, hello. But going back to RFK Jr. though, the hesitation I have with him is, as I get what he's saying, about there possibly being an incentive for big industries to push certain things that are harmful for us, red dye number 4, whatever it is. I think he crosses over a boundary that he shouldn't have crossed over, in that assuming that he was right. I think I think he's correct in bringing up these issues, but he goes one step further and starts to implement his own solutions to it when he has no scientific background whatsoever. One of them is the COVID virus thing, and I get the whole thing about COVID and the Anthony Fauci and so on, but you're basically trusting him to make decisions for you that are based on what he thinks is right. And I don't trust him. I trust him less than I trust any doctor out there. But I think he oversteps his boundaries in that area. And yeah, I agree. You should bring it up.
Yeah.
These issues should be brought
Well,
up.
something that I like is in one, I don't know if it was a senator House hearing that he did say, is he goes, hey, people shouldn't take medical advice from me. He said they should talk to their doctor. And I think it was when they were talking about removing the COVID vaccine schedule or recommendation for healthy young kids and healthy pregnant women. Uh, and I took the first 2 shots of the COVID vaccine, two first 2 Pfizer shots. But then when they started saying, hey, every 6 months, and I was like, you know what? Something about it just didn't feel right. I'm like, you don't even got to get the flu shot that much, and that thing's barely effective. For me, I mean, I still get it, but it doesn't do as well as I would hope it would. And and how sick I got off the second shot versus how sick I was when I had COVID, and I'm like, there really wasn't even that much of a difference for me. So why would I? And I get that's not every case, right? I'm not saying ban it, and I personally don't think that he is either. I think he's saying, hey, it should be a little bit more of up to you, kind of like the flu shot, unless you work in a hospital, is up to you, or depending on your company. And same thing he was saying with infant vaccines, right? Europe, they spread it out over a longer period of time, not like super long, but because I kind of attribute it to, well, if grandma kissing the baby is dangerous, so is putting a lot of that in them all at one time, right? Like, give it time to their body to process what's going on.
Yeah, that's an area that I can't comment on because I don't have a medical degree or anything, and I
Yeah.
would I agree with hesitation of trusting people with these types of things. But I think, yeah, I get your point about that. I was going to make a point and then I forgot about it. I forgot to write it down here. Otherwise, it went out of my head. But yeah, I got the first COVID shot when it first came out too, and then I got the boosters after that. The thing that they're trying to do, well, here's what I remember. The thing that they're trying to do with the flu shot and the COVID shots is it doesn't necessarily protect you from getting that virus. For you alone, it prevents you from dying from it. It's like putting on a safety belt, right? When you drive your car, it's not a guarantee, but it really increases your chances of surviving. But beyond that, if you look at the macro level, there's this thing called the R factor. You probably heard this before, and the R factor has to do with the spreadability of a virus.
Yes.
The R factor says that if you get the virus, how many people do you infect? If it's one or more, then the virus is going to explode exponentially. So what the old days before they had shots and antiviral medicines, they would solve that problem by isolating people. We can't do that anymore. Everybody's everywhere. Everybody's it's a very well
Oh, yeah.
connected society. So we have to cut down that R factor in other ways. and that involves taking the shot. So you're not taking the shot just for yourself. You're taking it as part of your, I would say, your personal duty to society, so that you're helping cut down that spreadability of the virus.
And I think that during COVID, I personally don't think no matter who would have been in office, whether it would have been a Republican, Democrat, and I'm sure obviously the approaches would have been a little bit different, right? But I feel like that was kind of like a no-win situation for any kind of politician.
Yeah, it was. And well,
Because you don't know what's going to happen.
I would put a caveat on that, because Trump was out when Trump was president when it first came out, and I think he did something extremely good, and that was he had Operation Warp Speed, and where he blew it politically was he should have made sure that Operation Warp Speed continued beyond his presidency, so that he put in place the mechanisms to distribute this virus and stamp his name on it. Instead, right after the mRNA virus antivirus medicines were made, he flipped and he went to the other side.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that was a missed opportunity for him.
Yeah,
And I think what he was trying to leverage off the lack of trust that people have for people like Anthony Fauci.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think,
And I don't got nothing personal against Anthony Fauci, like at all. I'm sure he's done a lot of good in certain areas, but that's like a whole nother thing. But like the more I've learned about the guy, the more I'm going, I'm not so sure about him. Like just I don't know, because I'm sure there's more than what's out there, right? There's always a lot more factors than any of us know, but uh, there's just something about his approach that I guess I didn't trust, and
mhm.
how he responded to things, and I didn't like that the narrative became during COVID that if you question anything, you're a bad person.
Yeah,
Especially up
yeah.
here in Michigan, that was the narrative. If you questioned anything that a doctor said in terms of COVID, something was wrong with you. You were a terrible person.
Oh, it was the messaging on that thing was horribly. Uh, it was just a horrible experience. They
Yeah,
did not do a good messaging on it whatsoever. Like I say, I think Trump was the right person at the time to get on top of that messaging, and he would have looked like a hero.
yeah, yeah. He
And
had the ability to.
yeah, he had the ability. I think he, like I said, I didn't vote for him. I personally, don't want to vote for him. I don't have many good things to say about him, but that is one good thing that was ultimately disappointing to me, that he didn't take it to its logical conclusion, because I think he would have looked like a real hero at that point. And in my opinion, he blew it. He stopped the messaging. He started the anti. I think he felt that the misplaced trust in government was was worth more political points to him
Yeah,
than telling people, hey, this is my antivirus. I got it. I made it possible. Take the shot for society. Um, Fauci also blew it. I think in messaging got blown by how this virus got started. Remember, first they said the wet market in Wuhan. Oh yeah, it was a bat that
yeah,
got someone under the cross with the whatever it was, which made sense to me, because I know a little bit about, even up to that point, I'd studied a little bit about viruses and how they spread and where they begin. That made sense to me until I learned that in Wuhan, there's a virus research lab,
yeah.
and then the conspiracy theory at that point was it came out of the lab. And that's one of those rare occasions where a conspiracy theory actually made sense to me. Like, I'll bet that lab had more to do with it than the wet
Oh yeah.
market.
And it came out what recently, not after Trump, long after he got elected or inaugurated, that the past 4 years they were like, oh, that's kind of a conspiracy theory, and then the CIA comes out and they're like, well, maybe it wasn't such a conspiracy theory after. Now I know they said it wasn't concrete evidence, but they're like, there's some pretty good evidence pointing in that direction. And do I think that Fauci had any intention to kill a bunch of people in the United States? No, but also would I put it past, hey, we're having an experiment here? Well, you're an American doctor with that's connected to a research lab in a country that's known for human rights violations.
Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
that definitely makes me go, okay, I don't trust you.
Yeah, I mean, people aren't stupid. They can put two and two together,
Yeah,
right? And exactly what they did. And ultimately, I think one of the things that happened too is we all heard about the Spanish flu, which was a century before. What surprises me is that we weren't ready for this. I mean,
right?
not in the sense of being technically ready, having the antivirus stuff ready. I get that. We never played out. Apparently, we never played out this scenario as a government. We never played out this war game, so to speak. Like, what's going to be our messaging if this happens and that happens? God knows we have plenty of people in government that are smart enough to figure this stuff out. They should have rolled out some sort of plan and then put it in motion when the pandemic broke out. But instead, it was just people just tripping over themselves. Trump used it as a daily talking point to get in front of the TV cameras and just ramble on incoherently about a whole bunch of stuff, which which just fuddled the message even more. He fumbled the ball even more by doing that, and it was like a clown show.
Yeah,
And in those environments, it's easy for conspiracy theories to take hold and start to rule the day. And so it was just one horrible mess after another. And every time someone tried to clean it up, they made an even bigger mess.
yeah,
I'm really disappointed that happened like that.
yeah. And it was ironic that had Trump had the opportunity to me then to be. He could have been what Ronald Reagan was to the immigrants. He could have been that to. He had enough. He has enough charisma to where he could have really led the charge and led people to be confident about themselves, to not live in such fear. He has that ability to people that are support him. But I think in a situation like that, if he'd been like that, people would have been like, "Oh, okay, wow, this guy should make sense on something that I agree with." And
Yeah.
I think he could really. I don't think we would have been stuck in things so long because and this is no. And I've talked about this in a couple other things I've recorded. No shade against Joe Biden at all. At one point, very smart guy, but you know, I feel his entourage definitely used him. I don't know. I would hope that he was the one calling the shots, but definitely when you watch the debate, you really had to question it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I felt like Trump would have been a way better person to handle that situation than Joe Biden. And that kind of, I mean, it is what it is, right? History is history. Joe Biden would have been, if Joe Biden would have got elected in 2016, I feel like, that would have probably been a better situation for him to get going in. By finding, and I think what Donald Trump just turned 79, I think
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
so, in
Yesterday.
the next year or two, he could start, when you get to a certain age, certain things can happen. And, Trump is definitely blessed with his cognitive abilities. He rambles, definitely blessed. But I
Well, he
think,
has a major speech problem, and I don't think that's really brought out enough that he rambles incoherently. And if you ever read what he's written or ever read what he says and read it verbatim, it is really hard to string this thing together.
yeah,
And I think that the media very often does what they call sane washing it. He made a point. It was in front of some economic forum. It was before the election, and they asked him a specific question. Gosh, I forgot what it was, but I just remember he rambled, and you could just see people looking around. And in the very end, he said, "But we're going to make America great again," or something. And then everybody claps, right? And it's just, I just watch that and I think, okay, maybe his mind is slipping already. I don't know.
oh yeah, but
Um,
I think he was very smart. And JD Vance isn't who I would have picked. I was definitely more in favor of Vivek Ramaswamy. I
really,
felt that he's a tad bit more of a forward-thinking conservative.
yeah,
He's
I've got
got some
some major issues with him.
yeah, he's got some traditional values in there, but he's also willing to think of things that aren't there. He's willing to hear different ideas. Whereas JD Vance seems to be a little bit more cut and dry. But what I like about Vance is he came from nothing. Served his country and that. But so in terms of if Trump had to step down, God forbid something happens to the president, which you never want to see happen. I would trust JD Vance a little bit more than I would Kamala. Seeing Kamala when she was running for president was just, I'm like, my God, the Democratic Party had so many better options than her. Where I felt like she kind of really, when she was on The View and she said, I wouldn't change anything. It's like, man, have you seen your own polls? Have you seen your people?
that was that was a true fumble of the ball right there.
I
I
think that was
bring
the
that up
nail
a
in the
lot.
coffin.
Yeah, that she really fumbled the ball at that point. And so maybe she felt like she had some personal allegiance to Joe Biden, and that's why she said it that way. But boy, oh boy, I think Biden would have understood if she would have just said, "Hey, this is what I'm going to do different," and and this is what Biden did. Maybe not a mistake, but boy, oh boy, it didn't work out right. So we're going to do things different. But she didn't. She just, and she looked unprepared to answer that question.
Oh, big time.
Which, yeah. And so who's advising her? I mean, come on. I know you don't want to know the questions in advance, nor should you, but you should have a whole list of questions you're ready to answer that are going to be the
Yes.
most likely questions asked. And that one just must have fallen through the cracks. And I thought, okay, that's it. She's done.
Yeah, and it was a shame. Some stuff in principle, I could kind of agree, like, hey, we should per se help people buy homes to a degree, right? But in that same instance, it's like, hey, man, unless you're going to talk about how to increase the supply of homes, all you're doing is raising the price on everybody. You know,
Yeah,
and
that's an issue I looked into quite deeply. So I got some scoop on
okay,
that if you want. Yeah. So when it comes to homes, you're right. Home prices are going way up. Now, I like to go back to 1980 because that's one of my favorite years to just sort of pin things down before things started to get too wild. But if you take the median salary and divide it into the average home price, you end up with a ratio of about 2.5. So in other words, the median salary, let's say, for example, it was like say $15,000. Then your average home would have cost 2.5 times $15, which would have been what about 3750 or something like 37,500. So if my math is right, these days, if you take the median salary and divide it into the average home price, it's getting close to 6 to 1. We have a situation here where just young couples that want to come out, and my son he's 30 years old now, and he's getting started in his life and his career. Young couples that want to start a family and buy a home, and a home is the best way to build up equity. The You really can't unless both mother and father are working
yeah,
to just afford that home. Now that presents things on the party of so-called family values, right? Where are the family values when the kid is born? They don't get maternity leave or anything like that. So a month and a half later, boom, the kid's in daycare. That is not a healthy environment. I would argue it's not.
no, not at all.
It's. I mean, some
Dangerous.
daycares are exceptional, but for the most part, it is not a healthy environment for a young baby like that. It's just absorbing, everything it's going to build its knowledge on for the rest of its life. It's not a healthy environment.
No, and I don't think especially when it comes to that as a country, we definitely don't do a good job taking care of
Well,
infants and
in
things of that
let
nature.
me build on that a little bit more. I know I tend to ramble, so just
Yeah, no,
cut
no
me
problem.
off. But what's happening right now is that the big three financial companies, you got State Street, Vanguard, was it BlackRock? I
Yeah,
think it
BlackRock, yeah,
is. They are buying homes,
hmm
sometimes sight unseen,
and Berkshire.
buying homes and renting them out, right? So young couples go out, even if they can afford to buy a home right now, they go out and try to buy a home. They're bidding against these big finance companies. Where the finance companies getting their money from? Oh, a lot of it comes from our 401ks. So our 401k is working against us. And so what they want to do is turn America into a rental society. But the whole idea of America, the American dream, is to own your own home.
Yeah,
And when your kids grow up, you get a big home. Kids grow up, they're gone. You're empty nesters. You got equity in that home now. You can't do that if you're renting. So that's one of those problems where okay, this is capitalism in action, right? But we've got to put some sort of brakes on this sort of thing
yeah,
because this is just not fair to the American family.
no, not at
They
all.
work hard and their 401k money should be doing some work for them. But on the other hand, if it's working against them and buying a home out from underneath them and renting it out to them, I would argue this is not really an optimal situation.
Affordable living, no matter what pretty much out of any issue you could bring up in politics, affordable living affects all of it more than any other subject
Hmm.
affects the other. That because that's your ability to wake up in the morning and put your shoes on and put food in your mouth, and and it's the government's response always seems to be in a lot of politicians is we'll give you money to get you a place.
Yeah, that's Yeah.
and that doesn't fix the root cause
Right.
of the
Exactly.
corporations buying it, and the fact that because they're buying it, that creates a lack of supply.
Right.
And that which drives up the prices. Anybody who knows the basis of capitalism knows less supply, higher price. And capitalism is supposed to be, if there's a demand, we build more. Where in America, our capitalism is flipped, and if there's demand, we build less so we can make more money.
Yeah. Yeah. You put your finger right on it right there. I think that was absolutely the point there.
But yeah,
So that, oh,
I would definitely love to have you on here again, Dan. This has been,
sure. Yeah. I'd love to come back anytime.
you progress on things. Hopefully, you found that this is definitely a little bit middle of the road. That's kind of what my whole podcast is geared after, is
Well,
talking to everybody.
I was with you on the middle of the road thing till you brought up Ramaswamy because that's a whole,
He's
whole story I can tell you about him. That these guys a snake, man.
I don't know in person. I just know some of the things that I've seen, some of his speeches, and I'm like, well, fundamentally, I can agree with some of that, and you
Well,
know,
here's the thing that people said this about Trump way back in 2015 and 16 when he was running. Say, oh, we need a businessman to run our nation. The government is not a business. It's not a for-profit center. And so business people have absolutely no idea how government works in general. They just know how to go to government and get the money, to sell stuff to the government, but they have no idea how it works internally, nor do they appreciate it. So I would say being a business person is not something I'd put on my resume if I were running for a government position.
and that's definitely where some of Trump's frustrations come in, because he's used to being a CEO per se, or president
Yeah.
and being like, hey, this is what I want, this is when I want it, and I want it now. And it's like, well, when you're in that position, you've got to scratch a lot of backs to make something like that happen. It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
as easy as pointing your finger. And
No,
but
it isn't. It's exactly you hit the nail on the head there.
and I think it's dangerous that it seems like every president tries to outdo the previous one on executive orders. It's like this competition. Who can become a bigger emperor than the previous? You know,
Exactly.
and I'm like, Biden had to outdo Trump. Trump had to outdo Obama, and now Trump's gonna. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
guys.
it's
It was like the Supreme Court said, and I had kind of talked a little bit about on your thing, reproductive rights.
mhm.
Um, I know a lot of politicians talk about, are things not being shouldn't be legislated by the judges. Well, the Supreme Court said, even when it overturned Roe v. Wade,
Mhm.
well, Congress needs to do its job and actually do something about it. Like actually pass a law instead of passing the buck to us, and then when we don't do what you want, being upset about it. And I thought that right there, I'm like, and that's why we have the problems we have in this country, because Congress would rather pass some law that its no is not going to pass the muster of going to a president, or however you want to put it, or a president
Yeah.
knows he's not going to. And then we get it up to the Supreme Court, and then we blame them if they don't vote our way.
Yeah, man, I love what you're saying here because I think the Congress has abdicated a lot of its responsibility, including this emergency thing that Trump claims that so he can start using the tariffs and go crazy with tariffs. That is stepping right into right on Congress's toes, really. That is
Yeah,
an area that Congress should be handling. And furthermore, with the executive orders, I get why presidents get frustrated because Congress moves so slow. So I understand it, but how many presidents do you know? And I'm putting Obama in that same category. How many times has Obama gotten off his butt and walked down to Capitol Hill or walked up to whatever they call it and start dealing with these people directly? How many times do you go to Mitch McConnell and say, Mitch, we got to cut a deal here or something? I know what you said about me gumming up the works and stuff, but let's, I mean, I think Reagan and
Tip O'Neill.
Tip O'Neill had a great relationship because Reagan knew that. He knew how to get out there and do it. Now, I didn't agree with Reagan on everything. I voted for him twice, but I since then I've sort of regretted that. But on the other hand, he was a masterful politician in that area, and he could talk to Congress. And he didn't. I'm sure he signed some executive orders. I never looked at it, but he had his relationship with Tip O'Neill, and we haven't had that since.
No,
And
not at
now what
all.
happens? We got these vertical columns, one's in the White House, one's in Capitol Hill, and they just don't talk to each other. And I'm like, you got to get off your butt, Mr. President, and get over there and talk to these people.
Oh yeah,
And even the ones that are your sworn enemies, talk to them.
and I think, and when it comes to Trump, I think that's where he did a good job picking JD Vance. Vance is a little bit more in tune with life than Mike Pence was. Mike
Mm-hmm.
Pence was definitely cut off from, not knocking him, but you know, reality had checked out for him a long time ago in terms of his views.
Mm-hmm.
His views didn't even align with a lot of the Republican Party anymore. Where Vance is a little bit more, okay, let's look at this problem in a little bit more modern light. And I thought it was awesome at the when Vance talked about the fact that his mom was addicted to, I think it was crack or whatever it was, for 10 years, and he joined the Marines, I believe it was, served and became a lawyer, blah blah blah. But it seems like he has the ability to kind of, he's been able to negotiate certain things within the Senate that under, Trump's previous administration, where it was a lot more of a dogfight. Even with Mike Pence, like Mike Pence didn't have that ability to reach across even to, non-MAGA Republicans and go, hey, we do have something in common here. Let's make
Yeah.
this work. And I think that Vance is definitely helping bridge that gap a little bit these days.
I would have my doubts about that, and I don't mean to just doubt you for the sake of
Okay.
doubting you, but Vance, his experience, his political experience is extremely limited. Mike Pence actually had far more political experience, and I think it was up to Trump to direct Vance. I mean, to direct Pence
True.
to go over there and start making some deals. I mean, any president that has vice presidents only have one duty, right?
That'd
To
be a
be the
tiebreaker.
president of the Senate.
Yeah.
But no, I think a good president would take advantage of a good vice president, especially if they had experience like Pence did. I don't agree with Pence either on a whole lot of things, but I think he was capable of doing that. I think he
Yeah,
was
for
very
sure.
capable of doing that, but he just didn't have the direction from Trump to do it. And I think if you don't get that direction, you're just not going to do it.
Oh yeah, what I kind of like what Trump decided to do this time around with his chief of staff, right, is obviously first female chief of staff in U.S. history. I don't think that's talked about enough. But she also, I remember hearing that she said, "Hey, unless I can control the clown show around you, I'm not interested."
Yeah.
And she, and that was like a very big point that she made is like, unless I, because she felt that the previous side, it was just it was free reign. People just did what they wanted to do, and that's why it was so chaotic. Where obviously Trump's nature is chaos. It
Mhm.
seems to be definitely a little bit more organized chaos these days. And
Well,
he's
he's got a blueprint to go from now. He's got the Project 2025.
yeah,
Um,
that's a whole oof.
yeah, I can talk for hours about that thing, how much I completely disagree with it. But
I can say I know a lot of conservatives who disagree with a lot of that.
yeah, but I'm
Personally
thinking
conservatives.
that's Trump's blueprint right now, and that's his playbook, and that's the wrong playbook in my opinion. Extremely wrong playbook. It's got so many flaws in it.
And it's not.
Um,
It's very anti-Americans, anti
it
to
is
our
it is very
values.
anti-American, and that's where I have my problem with Trump right now. Is that and with Vance as well. They're following this playbook, and I don't like it one bit. I mean, that's why I was out. I was in St. Louis yesterday, joining. I don't know what the crowd was. I estimated 5,000, but I think it's more like about 20,000 because my view on the ground is very limited. But I saw some views from the air, and I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot of people out there. But I was out there marching with people on No King's Day because the things like Project 2025 really upset me. And if they go through with this, it's going to be tough. I agree with you. It's anti-American, and that's not the way we should be going, in my
No,
opinion.
and I can't think of outside of certain politicians. Most conservatives don't even really acknowledge its existence, and a lot of
Yeah,
conservatives, even in the Senate and the House, they're kind of like, yeah, we're not too interested in that.
yeah, but ask them to stand up and say it, and they won't.
Yeah, that's the hard part, and that's where sometimes it takes a little. I think you'd find certain senators that would be a little bit more willing to stand up against it than others. Vast majority
Yeah,
wouldn't, but
well, that's what these demonstrations do. It's going to let these senators and representatives know that a lot of Americans are not cool with this at all, and it might give them a little bit more confidence to stand up and to withstand any sort of threats from Trump to try to out primary them.
Yeah, and before we wrap it up here, now we're talking about Congress a little bit. You're running for office. Something that I don't want to say is like near and dear to I've been a little bit of a quick back thing is when I was 13, I discovered the Libertarian Party
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of it behind it, and I, I'm like, man, this makes a whole lot of sense to me. And usually in life, it's the opposite for a lot of people. They
Yeah.
start out liberal, then they grow conservative. It seems to be in this country. Well, I started out, Thomas Sowell, and those guys. I like a lot of what they have to say, But the one thing that I've noticed that a lot of them talk about, which created a lot of the problems in this country, is when they made the U.S. Senate a popular vote instead of appointed by the state legislatures.
Yeah.
And I get why they went away from it because of certain corruption, things like that. But I think something like that could have been addressed legally with the corruption aspect. But where I think a lot of our problems come in is the Senate was the reason why the Senate appoints all these people is because this is the federal government. So it's supposed to represent the state governments, and that's why, the state governments we form the union and we represent ourselves to the world, on political whims, right? And my thinking behind that is, and the reason why I think that it's created the popular vote with the Senate, created the issues we have now is a lot of state issues are very similar to federal issues, right? Healthcare, for instance. I truly believe in my heart that we would actually have a functioning healthcare system if the Senate was appointed by the states, because the majority of states, even Republican states, Mitt Romney in Massachusetts, case in point, recognize that these are problems. And then in the House is always a lot more progressive, even Republicans in the House, than the Senate is. Senate, most of them tend to be on the more conservative side, no matter which party you're in, depending on spectrum. But I think that we would get a lot more issues done because the state's problems like, hey, we're having an education problem. Well, guess what? The House is too. The common people are having that. Okay, so now the federal government is talking to the people, where right now is popular political money create chaos, and I kind of think that that's where the principle behind, I believe it's the 17th Amendment, makes a lot of sense. But I think that in today's day and age, it doesn't fit what we need. And I think that if the Senate was representing the state governments, I'd probably say 70% of our issues would be addressed in some way, form, or another. And I think there'd be a lot more compromise to getting them done.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. I think it is. You're right. The 17th Amendment, which made for people to vote directly for the senators, but I don't know. I'll have to think about that one because I know that the state governments. I'm running for a state government position. One of the things I discovered when looking at politics when I first decided to run, or before I decided to run, I thought, hey, if I'm ever going to run, I'm going to run for like U.S. Congress or something like that. Then I began to realize, actually the power is in the states. That's where all these movements start. The gay rights movement, probably one of the most recent ones. But a lot of these movements start in the state level and they work their way up to the federal level.
Yes.
So the state legislators actually have a lot more long-term effect on this nation. And so I think that's, it's not a well-known point, although the Republicans learned this a long time ago. And they started with this process of trying to recruit all the state governments, and that would help them consolidate the federal government. And they were right. They were right.
Done a pretty good job over the last 30 years of that.
Yeah, they were absolutely right about it. And the Democrats, as usual, tend to be reactive and not proactive. I'm going to try to change that as a Democrat. I wasn't a Democrat until I decided to run. And the only reason why I decided to run was because, well, the thing that pushed me over the edge, I should say, is I kept bugging the Democratic Party in Missouri here and saying, how come you don't have anybody running for my district? And they turned the argument around on me and said, well, why don't you run? So I did the old Homer Simpson, don't. So I joined the Democratic Party but when I joined them, I said, I have some ideas that may not be 100% in tune with the Democratic Party. Some fairly radical ideas, not radical, but progressive, I should say. Things like ranked choice voting and things like that.
Oh, ranked choice voting would save our country.
Yeah, but that's something that you have to fight both the Democrats and the Republicans for that because they like the game the way it is. Yeah, it's the establishment, right? And I don't know if actually got to talk to Ralph Nader on a podcast one time, but if you're familiar with with his campaigns, and his campaign manager was this lady Teresa. Oh gosh, I forgot her last name now. My mind goes blank, but she wrote a book about the campaigns of 2000 and 2004. Teresa Amato, I think it was. Teresa Amato, and anyway, she wrote this, and it was just amazing to me how she went into detail about Ralph Nader's struggle to get recognized to be a presidential candidate, and how he had to fight the Democrats and Republicans. And I'm like, we got to, we got to dislodge this old guard and get some new politics in here because right now it's obvious to me it's not working at
Case
this
in
point.
point, Gary Johnson, when the presidential committee for the debates, Gary Johnson's probably the most, outside of Ross Perot, one of the most successful third party candidates in modern history.
Yeah, yeah,
And they were like, oh man, this guy's popular. Boop, change the rules. Can't have that guy on
yeah,
TV.
exactly, absolutely.
You
What was that? The League of Women Voters used to sponsor the presidential debates up until I think it was 1988 or something like that. Go back and look at the memo that they wrote. The reason why they dropped sponsoring the presidential debates because politics got involved in it. And then so after that, the Committee for Presidential Debates, I think it's CPD, I think it was the name of the organization, they ran the presidential debates from then on. And yeah, you're right, man. They made it impossible for third parties to get into these debates. In fact, Ralph Nader was escorted out by security. He just wanted to attend debates as an audience member, and they recognized him and escorted him out, physically forced him out of there. And this is, so yeah, both parties. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I don't want to badmouth the Democrats too much because
no, they got
I
they're
yeah,
important.
there's a lot of good things about them too, but they're part of that establishment,
Oh yeah,
and we've got to fight that as well.
something that Trump did that I thought was like I thought was very, I don't even know the right way to put it, but he decided he was going to go in front of the Libertarian National Convention,
Hmm.
and he got a lot of boos and a lot of people standing up, turning their backs against him.
Yeah.
But I had to respect the fact that he was essentially willing to go into the lion's den and go, "Hey,
Yeah.
this is me." And a lot of people didn't like it, but I mean, I can't really think of very many politicians, Democrat or Republican, that would go to their opposite party's convention and be like, "Hey, how are you?" And it's like that kind of approach. Those to me, while we're wrapping this up, I think we need more of that. More people willing to say, "Hey, I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, but guess what? We occupy the same dirt. We drink the same water."
We live on the same rock. Yeah, I just one thing to add to that. I know you want to wrap this up, but my opponent in the upcoming election um, is he's not the incumbent because the incumbent is going to leave and run for a state senate position. But he and I went out to lunch about a week and a half ago. We run into each other quite a bit. Decided to have lunch about a week and a half ago, and he says, "Hey, I'm going to have this official announcement party that I'm running." He says it's going to be on like June 28th or something like that. He says, "Do you want to come to that?" And I thought that's pretty cool that he would invite me to that, right? And at first I said yes, but then I said no, and it wasn't because I didn't want to be there, but it was I said Dave is his name. I said, Dave, this is your show. I don't want to steal your thunder. Okay, I'd love to be there. I would just be a fly on the wall. I promise I wouldn't, go out and try to recruit people to the Democrats or anything. But I'd love to be there to try to understand you a little bit more. But I don't want to steal your thunder by showing up at your party. And he
Yeah,
understood too, and I think there's a line we have to draw between us. But it was so nice of him to say that to me, even though he and I disagree about everything right across the board. But we still have a lot of respect for each other.
yeah, and that's important, and we need more of that rather than the bickering,
Yeah, yeah,
and
I
the
agree.
infighting. But Dan, it was great having you on.
Well,
Uh,
thanks, Joe. I
you
appreciate
know,
it.
and I look forward to having you on again soon.
Yeah, give me a shout anytime. I'll send you my contact information, and
Okay, and I'll
we
reply
can
with
you
it.
just call me directly or whatever. And
Okay, all right. Thanks, Dan. Have a good one.
thanks, Joe. You too.
Bye
Thanks.
bye.
Bye.